The rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking the road as the van rattled its way toward the looming shadow of the Garnet House. No one spoke inside the vehicle, not since they crossed the old, rusted sign that read, "Stay away." The four-person investigation team, specially selected by the government, had heard the stories of the inexplicable deaths, the disappearances, and the madness that plagued anyone who entered the mansion. Special Agent Cole sat in the passenger seat, gripping the handle on the door tightly, his eyes darting toward the blackened structure up ahead. The mansion seemed to glow in the storm's lightning flashes, revealing its twisted architecture, rotting wood, and gaping windows like empty eye sockets. "It's worse than the reports said," muttered Jackson, the ex-military operative in the back seat. His voice carried a hardness earned through combat, but even he seemed rattled by the sight of the house. Dr. Evelyn Marks, the team's paranormal expert, sat beside Jackson, flipping through pages of old classified files. "This house, it's not just haunted, it's a magnet for evil. There have been over 20 disappearances tied to this place, and no one has come out alive for the last 70 years. "Perfect," muttered Cole. "And we're supposed to be the ones to change that." The van rolled to a stop at the iron gates of Garnet House, which swung open on their own, creaking loudly as if the very house itself invited them in. The tension inside the vehicle thickened. As they approached the front door, Cole noticed something odd. The mansion seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing. He blinked, chalking it up to the rain and shadows, but a creeping chill slid down his spine. "I've got a bad feeling about this," muttered Sarah, the team's tech specialist, pulling out her camera. Her eyes widened as she scanned the eerie exterior of the house. Before anyone could respond, the front door creaked open with a slow groan, revealing nothing but blackness inside. "Standard sweep," Jackson barked, stepping out first with his flashlight raised, its beam cutting through the thick mist. They entered the house cautiously, one by one. As the door closed behind them, an unsettling silence took hold. It was as if the storm outside had been swallowed by the mansion itself. Cold drafts whistled through the empty halls. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, flickering like old, grainy film. Then came the first sign. A soft, almost inaudible whisper slithered through the air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, gripping her equipment tightly. Before anyone could respond, a loud bang erupted from upstairs, followed by something dragging across the floor. Cole's pulse spiked as the floor beneath their feet seemed to tremble slightly. "Stick together," Jackson ordered, though his own voice wavered with doubt. And so, they ventured deeper into the belly of the beast. The hallway stretched out before them, impossibly long and twisted. Faint candlelight flickered on sconces that hadn't been lit in years. Each step felt heavier than the last, the atmosphere pressing down on their chests as if the house was closing in around them. "I don't like this. I don't like this one bit," Sarah muttered, her camera shaking slightly as she filmed the narrow hallway. As they advanced, the whispers returned, but louder this time, like voices speaking just out of earshot, crawling beneath the skin. Cole felt his heartbeat quicken. The whispers didn't seem to be coming from one place, but from everywhere, surrounding them, pushing them forward. "Hold it together," Jackson said, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "We're in control here." But it was clear to everyone they were anything but in control. They reached a door at the end of the hall, a massive oak slab marked with deep gouges, as though something had desperately tried to claw its way out, or in. "Who's opening it?" Jackson asked, looking at the others. Silence. Cole stepped forward, ignoring the gnawing sense of dread in his gut. With one swift motion, he pushed the door open. Inside was a room that could only be described as wrong. The walls were covered in torn, faded wallpaper that seemed to drip like wet paint. The furniture was arranged in bizarre angles, defying logic, and in the center of the room stood a single chair, facing away from them. "Is someone," Evelyn began, but her voice choked off as the chair turned on its own. There was no one sitting in it. A deep, guttural growl echoed from behind them, and the door slammed shut. Panic gripped the team as the temperature dropped drastically, their breath fogging in front of them. Shadows twisted and coiled in the corners of the room, growing thicker and darker. The whispers became screams. Cole grabbed for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped." The temperature in the room plummeted, and an oppressive chill washed over them, freezing the air in their lungs. The screams intensified, reverberating off the walls as if the house itself was howling in agony. Jackson slammed his shoulder against the door, his brawn useless against whatever invisible force held it shut. "Move," Cole shouted as he grabbed Jackson's shoulder to stop him. "It's not the door. It's the house." Evelyn, wide-eyed and trembling, backed into a corner, her breath hitching as something cold brushed against her. "There's something in here with us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, Sarah's camera flickered violently, and the lights on her equipment blinked out. "I've lost all readings," she cried, her voice thick with terror. She frantically slapped at the device. "We're blind." Without warning, the shadows began to shift, spiraling toward the center of the room like a cyclone of darkness. In the middle of it stood a figure barely visible, but undeniably malevolent, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its face hidden beneath a hood of shadows. A low growl emanated from its direction, vibrating through the floor, rattling their bones. "We need to move now," Jackson growled, taking a defensive stance, but it was too late. A deafening roar erupted from the figure, and something unseen slammed into Jackson, throwing him across the room like a rag doll. He crashed into the wall with a sickening thud and slumped to the floor, groaning in pain. His gun skittered across the floor, useless. Before anyone could react, the entity lunged toward Evelyn, invisible claws slashing through the air. She screamed, clutching her arm as blood soaked through her sleeve. "We're not alone here. We're surrounded," Cole yelled, grabbing the nearest object, a broken chair, and swinging it wildly at the darkness. His makeshift weapon passed through the air, hitting nothing. But the attack didn't stop. The air itself seemed to come alive, gripping, pulling, tearing at their clothes, their skin. Evelyn staggered backward, her face pale as she tried to stanch the bleeding from her arm. Sarah stumbled, eyes darting wildly as the shadows swirled around them. "It's everywhere. We can't see it. Focus," Cole snapped, his voice shaking as he pulled a flashlight from his pack. He switched it on, and the beam cut through the darkness for a brief second before it flickered and died. "No, not now." The growls grew louder, the figure in the center swelling with the shadows until it towered over them. It reached out with inky tendrils, tightening its grip around the room. Jackson groaned, trying to stand, but collapsed under the weight of the air itself pressing down on him. Cole swung the broken chair again, desperate, but his hands met nothing but icy air. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't playing by their rules. "We're going to die here," Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face as the darkness closed in. The suffocating darkness seemed to stretch time, seconds turning into hours as the team struggled for survival. The entity's growls filled the room like a thunderstorm, a cacophony of pure malevolence. But then a sound, a sharp crack, echoed from above, cutting through the chaos like a blade. A jagged crack appeared in the ceiling, light spilling through it in fragmented beams. The shadows recoiled, hissing, as if burned by the mere touch of light. "Move!" Towards the light, Cole shouted, seizing the chance. He reached for Evelyn, pulling her toward the beam, but the shadows coiled around her ankles, dragging her back into the blackness. Jackson, finally regaining his strength, roared in defiance and charged at the shadows with everything he had left, managing to break their grip on Evelyn. "Not today, you bastard," he growled, pulling her free and tossing her toward the crack in the ceiling. Cole, Evelyn, and Sarah scrambled toward the light, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Jackson was right behind them, but the shadows lunged again, wrapping around his legs like living chains. He grunted, fighting back as they pulled him deeper into the room. "Go! Get out!" he bellowed, struggling against the unseen force. His eyes locked with Cole's, the unspoken words between them clear. He knew he wasn't making it out. "No!" Cole yelled, but Jackson shook his head. "I'll hold it off. You go!" Jackson shouted as he took out a knife from his boot and began slashing at the darkness around him. Cole hesitated, torn between saving his friend and the survival of the team. Evelyn screamed as another tendril lashed out, barely missing her. The light from the crack grew brighter, forcing the shadows to writhe and retreat. Jackson! Cole's voice cracked as he was dragged forward by Sarah and Evelyn toward the opening in the ceiling. With one last glance, he saw Jackson plunge his knife into the heart of the shadow as it swallowed him whole. The next second, they were yanked into the light. The cold air hit them like a wall as they emerged on the roof, gasping for breath, but Jackson was gone. The night sky above them stretched vast and silent, as if the house had never existed at all. The roof was eerily quiet, the air heavy with tension. Cole, Sarah, and Evelyn gasped for breath, their bodies drenched in cold sweat. Jackson's sacrifice hung over them like a cloud, the guilt weighing them down. But there was no time to grieve. The sky above was inky black, the stars hidden behind a thick veil of storm clouds. Wind howled through the trees surrounding the mansion, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of rot. Evelyn's arm, still bleeding from the earlier attack, dripped crimson onto the rooftop. "We need to find a way down," she whispered, her voice shaking. Sarah pulled out her flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the darkness. "We can't go back inside. Whatever that thing was, it's still down there." And now Jackson. Her words trailed off, choked by the rising panic. Suddenly, the roof beneath them groaned, as if the house itself was shifting. The wind picked up, swirling dust and debris in a maddening dance. Cole's eyes scanned the edge of the roof for any sign of an exit, when a low, guttural growl resonated from the darkness below. "They're coming," Evelyn hissed, clutching her wounded arm. "We have to move now." Cole peered over the edge of the roof and froze. Crawling out from the tree-line, moving in jerky, unnatural motions, were dozens of figures. Their skin was ashen, stretched tight over bones, their eyes hollow pits of black. The crawlers, creatures of nightmare. They scuttled on all fours like spiders, their elongated limbs dragging across the dirt. "Oh God!" Sarah whispered, backing away from the edge. "They're everywhere. They smell the blood," Evelyn murmured, glancing down at her injured arm. Her face went pale as she clutched the wound tighter. "We're attracting them." The crawlers began to scale the walls, their bony fingers digging into the cracks of the brick with ease. Cole's heart pounded in his chest. They were out of options. Without thinking, he grabbed a nearby metal pipe, yanking it free from the rooftop structure. "We fight our way out," he said through gritted teeth. Sarah shook her head frantically. "There's too many of them. We'll never make it." But her words were cut short as one of the crawlers launched itself onto the roof with terrifying speed. It hissed, its jaw unhinging far wider than it should, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. Cole swung the pipe, connecting with the creature's head, sending it flying off the roof. But more were coming. Dozens of them. "We have no choice," Cole shouted as another crawler leaped toward them, its claws outstretched. Evelyn ducked, just narrowly missing a swipe that would have torn her throat out. "Get to the far side of the roof," Cole commanded, his voice thick with desperation. But even as they moved, the crawlers closed in, their numbers overwhelming. Cole, Evelyn, and Sarah scrambled across the roof, their steps frantic as the crawlers closed in on all sides. The creatures moved unnaturally fast, their bodies contorting and bending in ways that defied logic. Each step the team took felt like an eternity as the monsters crept closer, their growls growing louder. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. A crawler had grabbed her ankle, its claws digging deep into her flesh. She fell, hitting the roof with a hard thud. "Help!" she shrieked, kicking wildly as the creature began to drag her toward the edge. Cole didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, swinging the metal pipe down with all his strength, striking the crawler's arm. The sickening sound of bone cracking echoed across the roof as the creature let go, screeching in pain. But more were coming, their beady black eyes gleaming in the darkness. "We're not going to make it," Evelyn gasped, her face pale from blood loss. Cole knew she was right. The crawlers had surrounded them, closing in like a pack of wolves. The roof was a trap, and they were caught in its jaws. But something about the creatures felt wrong, off, as if they weren't acting of their own will. Why aren't they attacking all at once? Cole muttered under his breath, his eyes darting between the advancing crawlers. "They're waiting." Evelyn shot him a terrified glance. "For what?" Before he could answer, The roof beneath them shuddered violently. The crawlers stopped in their tracks, their heads turning in unison toward the center of the mansion. A low, rhythmic thumping reverberated through the walls, like a heartbeat deep and slow. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, struggling to her feet, her face twisted in pain from her injured leg. Then, as if in response to the sound, the crawlers backed away, slinking toward the edges of the roof and descending the walls. The growls faded, leaving the group in stunned silence. "They're leaving," Evelyn said, her voice filled with disbelief. But Cole wasn't convinced. "This isn't over. They weren't attacking us. They were driving us here." "To what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as the thumping grew louder, more intense. Cole's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the source of the sound. The center of the mansion, where a dark, gaping hole had opened up in the roof. From within, the thumping grew louder, pulsing like a monstrous heartbeat. "We're about to find out," Cole muttered grimly, gripping the pipe tightly in his hands as the air around them grew thick with malevolent energy. The thumping echoed from deep within the hole, reverberating through the walls like a pulse of evil. Cole, Evelyn, and Sarah stood at the edge of the opening, staring into the darkness below. The crawlers had vanished, but the air was still thick with malice. It felt as though something far worse was waiting for them below. "We can't stay up here," Cole said, gripping the metal pipe like a lifeline. His knuckles were white. "Whatever's down there, it's worse than those things." Evelyn, pale and shaking from blood loss, nodded weakly. "We go together," she whispered, her voice laced with dread. Sarah swallowed hard. "Are we really going down there? Into that pit?" "We don't have a choice," Cole replied, his voice grim. "It's where they wanted us. We either face it or let it come for us up here." Without another word, Cole lowered himself into the hole, using the decaying wooden beams for support. The others followed, their hearts racing, fear tightening around their throats like a noose. The descent felt endless. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The heartbeat-like thumping grew louder, each pulse vibrating through their bones. Cole's flashlight flickered as they reached the bottom, a vast chamber carved into the stone beneath the mansion. The walls were slick with something thick and dark, the floor littered with ancient bones. "This place," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's been here for centuries," Sarah gasped, shining her flashlight toward the far end of the chamber. Something massive stirred in the shadows, something ancient and malevolent. Its body was a twisted mass of limbs and writhing darkness, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. "It's waiting for us," Cole said through clenched teeth. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, sending a wave of terror through the group. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight shaking. "We need to get out of here." But the chamber's walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing heavy with the stench of decay. The creature slithered forward, its body a nightmare of twisted shapes. It wasn't just one being. It was many fused together in a grotesque, impossible form. As it advanced, the thumping grew deafening, shaking the chamber with each pulse. The ground trembled beneath their feet, cracks spiderwebbing across the stone floor. "We're trapped," Evelyn gasped, clutching her wound. "We'll never make it out alive." Cole gripped the metal pipe, his eyes fixed on the abomination before them. "If we're going down, we're not going down without a fight." The creature lunged. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its twisted limbs reaching out like tendrils of darkness. Cole swung the metal pipe, striking one of its limbs with all his strength. The impact sent a shockwave up his arm, but the creature barely flinched. Its body seemed to absorb the blow, as if it were made of liquid shadows. Sarah screamed as another limb shot toward her, wrapping around her ankle and pulling her toward the creature. She clawed at the ground, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and shattering against the stone. "Help me!" Cole lunged forward, swinging the pipe again, this time severing the limb with a sickening squelch. The severed piece writhed on the ground before disintegrating into black smoke. But more limbs followed, rising from the shadows like serpents, each one writhing with hunger. Evelyn, pale and trembling, raised her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Look!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. In the center of the creature's mass, just beneath its writhing limbs, was something pulsating, glowing faintly with each thump. The source of the heartbeat. The heart, Cole muttered, eyes wide. That's what's controlling it. We need to destroy it. But getting close to the heart meant facing the full fury of the creature. Its limbs lashed out, smashing against the walls and floor, sending shards of stone flying through the air. The chamber shook violently, as if the creature's very presence was unraveling the foundations of the mansion. "We'll never get close enough," Sarah panted, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "It's too fast, too strong." Cole's mind raced. They needed a distraction, something to give them just enough time to strike at the heart. His eyes darted to the crumbling beams overhead, hanging precariously from the ceiling. "The beams!" he shouted. "If we can bring them down, we might be able to trap it, even if just for a moment." Evelyn nodded, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "But how? We can't reach them." Before she could finish, Cole grabbed a loose stone from the ground and hurled it toward the beams. The impact sent a shower of dust and debris raining down. Another swing of the pipe, and the ceiling groaned under the strain. With a deafening crack, the beams gave way. Chunks of wood and stone crashed down, burying the creature beneath the rubble. For a moment, the chamber was silent, but then the rubble began to move, the creature still writhing beneath it. "Now's our chance," Cole yelled, sprinting toward the exposed heart. Cole sprinted toward the creature's exposed heart, its dark glow pulsing like a beacon of malevolence. Every instinct told him to turn back, to run, but he knew this was their only chance. Behind him, Sarah and Evelyn scrambled over the fallen debris, the creature still thrashing beneath the rubble. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse along with the heart, as though the mansion itself was alive and feeding off the darkness that consumed it. The air was thick with decay, and Cole's every breath tasted like rot. He could hear the faint whispers again, the voices of those long dead, beckoning him closer to the heart. As Cole raised the metal pipe, ready to strike, a shadowy figure appeared in his path. It was tall and featureless, a wraith-like presence that exuded an ancient, terrifying power. The Shadow Man. Its empty eyes locked onto him, and Cole froze. The creature's heart throbbed, growing brighter, as if drawing energy from the Shadow Man's presence. Time seemed to slow as Cole stared into the void where the figure's face should be. His mind was filled with a chilling understanding. This entity was not of this world. It was the puppeteer, the force behind the creature, the crawlers, the skinwalkers. Everything. The Shadow Man raised a hand, and Cole felt his body seize up, paralyzed by an unseen force. His muscles strained, but he couldn't move. The pipe slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. A cold wave of fear gripped his heart. He couldn't stop it. From behind, Sarah screamed, rushing forward. "Cole!" she shouted, raising her own weapon, a broken beam of wood. She swung it at the Shadow Man with all her might, but it passed through him as though he were made of smoke. The Shadow Man turned, his gaze now fixed on Sarah. In that moment, Cole's paralysis broke. With a final surge of desperation, he grabbed the metal pipe and swung it toward the heart. The impact was immediate. A blinding flash of light exploded from the creature's core, and the thumping stopped. The Shadow Man let out an unearthly shriek as the light engulfed the chamber. The walls trembled, cracks forming as the ancient foundation began to collapse. "Run!" Cole shouted, grabbing Sarah by the arm as the mansion started to fall apart around them. The creature writhed in its death throes, its body disintegrating into the same dark smoke that had filled the air. The heart, now split in two, lay lifeless on the ground. But it wasn't over. Cole, Sarah, and Evelyn barely made it out of the chamber as the walls began to collapse. The staircase groaned beneath their weight as they sprinted up toward the mansion's entrance. Behind them, the distant echoes of the Shadow Man's wail still reverberated through the corridors, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Bursting through the front door, they stumbled into the courtyard, gasping for air. The sky above was dark, swirling with unnatural clouds that twisted and churned like the embodiment of chaos itself. The mansion stood behind them, now a crumbling ruin, but there was no relief. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and from the shadows of the surrounding woods, figures began to emerge. Crawlers, dozens of them, skittering toward the mansion, drawn by the destruction. Skinwalkers, too, their grotesque forms twisting and shifting as they approached, their hunger palpable. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay. "We're not safe yet," Evelyn gasped, clutching her wound, her face pale and gaunt. "They're still coming." Sarah looked around, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to keep moving. There's no way we can fight all of them." Cole's mind raced, searching for an escape. The rescue teams had never made it, and now, the army of creatures was closing in from all sides. The Shadow Man's influence still lingered, poisoning the very air they breathed. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air. Above them, helicopters appeared, their searchlights cutting through the dark clouds. The sound of gunfire erupted as soldiers descended from ropes, their weapons blazing. The government had finally responded. "Over here," Cole shouted, waving his arms as the soldiers made their way toward them. But even with their firepower, the crawlers and skinwalkers continued their relentless advance. It was as if the creatures were driven by something beyond instinct, something far more dangerous. As the soldiers opened fire, the creatures began to fall, but for every one that died, 2 more seemed to rise from the shadows. The ground cracked open, and from the fissures, dark tendrils of energy lashed out, pulling soldiers into the earth, their screams echoing in the night. The Shadow Man's form appeared in the sky above, looming over the battlefield, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "This isn't over," Cole whispered, his voice filled with dread. And then the sky itself seemed to split open, revealing a darkness deeper than any they had ever faced.